Father Vogel, we continue our series on St. Francis de Sales' Introduction to the Devout Life. We've now reached his final part, Part 5, and this is something of a conclusion to his book by looking really back, doing a yearly renewal of this decision, these resolutions that we have decided to do, as well as, how do we continue to examine ourselves, making sure that we're following this path of devotion that we have set out upon. So he says, as he begins this part, that our human nature falls away easily from our good dispositions. This is due to the frailty and evil inclination of our nature. It burdens our spirit and always drags it down unless we lift ourselves upward by repeated, lively, deliberate decisions. So we'll usually find this is that, to follow God requires this kind of effort. We can't just, if we don't ever think about and purposefully choose this path, we're going to end up getting on the wrong path at some point or another. We find that our sins build up and we can be drawn away unless we place ourselves back on that path. He uses an analogy. We're like birds which fall at once to the ground unless they increase the movements and strokes of their wings to keep them in flight. So that's just the same way. Unless we are purposefully flapping our spiritual wings trying to fly, we are going to end up crashing in a sense. So he says it's going to be necessary that you renew and repeat very often the deliberate decisions you have made to serve God. If you do not do this, there is danger that you may fall back to your former state, or rather into a much worse state. And so this is a reference from the Gospels where Jesus, dispels the demons, and if once swept clean, if nothing else is put there, if we don't fill ourselves with God, then more can end up coming in their place. He uses another analogy. He uses the analogy of a clock, which might not be as familiar to us for us who use digital clocks, but he's talking about the maintenance of the mechanics of a clock that's required. So maybe in this image you might think of maybe a car, but he says for a clock you have to wind it twice a day, in the morning and the evening, and then every year it needs to be dismantled to clean the rusty parts, to straighten those that are bent and to replace those that are worn out. And also you're going to oil it, lubricate it so that it's working better. Well, we could apply this to our cars, right? We need to do the same thing. There's certain maintenance that we need to do. Obviously, we've got to change the oil as part of it. It's the same thing with our spiritual life. We must do with our heart. So just like there's some daily maintenance for our mechanical things, so too we have our daily maintenance of our heart, especially the spiritual exercises that he's already talked about in the previous chapters that we do each day. But then he also says at least once a year our heart should in a sense be dismantled and all of its parts examined in detail. In other words, all its desires and passions are to be examined to remedy all of the defects that may be there. So we really want to do a more kind of extensive examination of how we're doing in the spiritual life. And then, of course, just like we need to lubricate the parts of like the car or the watch or whatever it is so that it keeps functioning, so too, he says, we need to be anointed with the sacraments, especially of confession and the Eucharist, having renewed this, so that we are put in that proper running condition to be able to continue in the spiritual life. So in the next chapter, we're going to look specifically at, so he's going to give some points of how to meditate upon the firm resolution that we made after we made those series of 10 meditations at the beginning of moving into the spiritual life. He's going to give some shorter meditations to look back. And so he says to make 1 or 2 or 3 of these meditations on these points. So as we go through it, and I'll mention when we look at these points in the next video, he's not expecting us necessarily to use all of them, but to use some of them as it helps us to look back and renew this commitment that we've made to follow the Lord in this devout life. God bless.